The Lancaster bomber shouldn't have terrified anyone. At least that's what Luftwaffe pilots told themselves when they first encountered it in early 1942. Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen, a decorated night fighter ace, described his initial reaction in post-war interviews. "We called it the fliegende Scheune, the flying barn, because it looked like someone had strapped wings to a farmer's storage building." The nickname wasn't affectionate, it was dismissive, almost pitying. Here was a bomber so enormous, so ungainly, that it seemed to advertise its own vulnerability against the dark European sky. The Lancaster measured 69 feet in length, with a wingspan stretching 102 feet across. When you compare that to the American B-17 Flying Fortress, itself no lightweight, the Lancaster was actually 4 feet longer and had a wider span. But dimensions alone didn't earn it the barn comparison. The fuselage cross-section measured 7 feet at its widest point, creating a distinctly rectangular profile that lacked the streamlined elegance of its contemporaries. To German radar operators and visual spotters alike, this silhouette read as an easy mark, a lumbering target painted against the night. What really cemented the barn nickname was the Lancaster's greenhouse-style canopy. The cockpit featured extensive perspex glazing that wrapped around the pilot and flight engineer positions, creating enormous reflective surfaces. On moonlit nights, or when caught by searchlights, these panels would gleam like beacon windows on a country barn. Luftwaffe pilot Heinz Röcker later recalled, "You could spot them from 5 kilometers away when conditions were right. The canopy would catch the light, and suddenly you had a perfect aiming point." But nicknames in warfare often carry a dangerous irony, and the Lancasters would prove particularly treacherous to those who believed it. By March 1942, when RAF Bomber Command first deployed Lancasters operationally against the German battleship Tirpitz, the aircraft had already begun contradicting its comedic designation. The raid on Augsburg that followed on 17th April 1942 saw 12 Lancasters flying in broad daylight at rooftop height across occupied France. 7 didn't return, but the 5 that reached the target delivered their payload with devastating accuracy. This wasn't barn-like behavior. This was aggression that bordered on suicidal courage. The psychological element of the nickname reveals something crucial about how the Luftwaffe initially underestimated British heavy bomber development. German intelligence had grown accustomed to the limitations of earlier RAF bombers, the underpowered Hamptons, the cramped Wellingtons, the problematic Manchesters. When the Lancaster appeared as an evolution of the failed Manchester design, German analysts assumed it would inherit the same vulnerabilities. They were cataloguing physical dimensions without understanding the revolutionary engineering beneath that barn-like exterior. The name spread through Luftwaffe squadrons stationed across occupied Europe with remarkable speed. By summer 1942, interception reports routinely used Scheune as shorthand for Lancaster contacts. Night fighter crews would radio positions using phrases like Scheune formation heading northeast. The terminology became so embedded that it appeared in official Luftwaffe tactical assessments. One document from Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, dated August 1942, described Lancaster formations as large, slow-moving targets presenting favourable engagement profiles. The assessment would age poorly. What the barn nickname failed to capture was intent. Yes, the Lancaster was massive. It needed to be. That cavernous bomb bay, stretching 33 feet down the fuselage centerline without any internal obstructions, could swallow payloads that would physically not fit inside B-17s or B-24s. The very features that made it look agricultural were actually ruthless design choices prioritizing destructive capacity over aesthetics. Every square foot of that barn-like structure served payload delivery. The irony deepened throughout 1942 as Lancaster squadrons multiplied across Bomber Command. By year's end, the RAF had more than 200 operational Lancasters, and German night fighter pilots began noticing something unsettling. These barns kept coming back. They absorbed punishment that should have downed them, maintained formation through flak that shredded other bombers, and their crews displayed a persistence that transformed comedy into concern. The nickname remained, but the laughter had started dying somewhere over the Ruhr Valley. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines defined the Lancaster in ways that transcended mere propulsion. Each engine produced 1,280 horsepower at takeoff, giving the bomber a combined output of 5,020 horses, dragging 65,000 pounds into hostile airspace. The Germans had nothing comparable in their own bomber fleet. The Heinkel, her 177 struggled with chronic engine fires, and most Luftwaffe bombers relied on twin-engine configurations that couldn't approach Lancaster payload capacity. This 4-engine arrangement wasn't just about power, it created redundancy that German pilots learned to curse. Oberleutnant Martin Becker, flying Bf 110 night fighters out of Leeuwarden in Holland, documented a March 1943 engagement that illustrated the Merlin advantage perfectly. His combat report described pumping 20mm cannon shells into a Lancaster's port outer engine until it erupted in flames and the propeller feathered. The Lancaster didn't descend, it didn't even break formation. The British simply continued as though we'd inconvenienced them rather than crippled them, Becker wrote. On 3 engines, they maintained altitude and speed sufficient to reach their target. We had to disengage due to fuel limitations, knowing they would likely survive to bomb and return home. The mathematics of 4-engine survivability haunted Luftwaffe tactical planning throughout 1943. A Lancaster could theoretically fly on 2 engines, though barely. More importantly, it could fight and navigate effectively on 3, maintaining roughly 160 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. German twin-engine bombers, by contrast, became coffins when they lost a single power plant. This asymmetry meant that damage which would guarantee a kill against a Dornier or Junkers bomber merely wounded a Lancaster. Night fighter pilots had to achieve either catastrophic structural damage or knock out multiple engines simultaneously, difficult propositions when your firing window lasted perhaps 3 seconds. The Merlin engines themselves deserved their legendary reputation. Developed originally for the Spitfire fighter, these V-12 liquid-cooled power plants delivered reliability that bordered on the supernatural. Lancasters routinely returned to base with engines that had absorbed shrapnel, lost coolant, or suffered cylinder damage, yet continued running. One famous incident from 460 Squadron RAAF in September 1943 saw Lancaster ED-860 return to Binbrook with its starboard inner engine completely destroyed, the crankcase shattered by flak. Yet the Merlin had kept rotating long enough for the crew to feather it properly and maintain control. The remaining 3 brought them home across 400 miles of North Sea. But those 4 engines created a signature that worked against the Lancaster in ways the designers never anticipated. The Merlin produced a distinctive deep throb at cruising power, a sound that carried for miles on still nights. German sound locators, acoustic ranging equipment positioned around likely approach routes, could detect Lancaster formations before radar picked them up. Worse still, the 4-engine configuration meant 4 separate exhaust flame patterns. Despite flame-dampening shrouds fitted to later models, night fighter pilots learned to spot the quartet of reddish glows from astern, especially during climbs when throttles advanced and exhaust temperatures peaked. The wingspan proved equally double-edged. At 102 feet tip to tip, The Lancaster presented an enormous radar cross-section to the increasingly sophisticated Liechtenstein and later SN2 airborne intercept radars equipping German night fighters. Radar operators could distinguish Lancasters from other bombers purely by the return signature. That massive wing structure reflected signals like a billboard. By late 1943, Luftwaffe crews preferred hunting Lancasters over other types, specifically because they were easier to acquire on radar. The barn nickname suddenly seemed prescient. The Lancaster was large enough to find, but potentially deadly enough to make the finding irrelevant. Yet here's where German fear began crystallizing. Despite being easier to locate, easier to track, and presenting a larger target, Lancasters proved devastatingly effective at reaching objectives. The four-engine redundancy meant successful interceptions often required multiple attack passes. Each pass increased the night fighters' exposure to the Lancaster's defensive armament, 8.303 Browning machine guns, concentrated in dorsal and tail turrets, with occasionally a ventral turret added. More critically, each pass consumed fuel and time while the bomber stream continued toward German cities. Night fighter pilots faced an impossible calculus: engage the easier-to-find Lancaster and possibly score a kill after extensive combat, or bypass it for softer targets while knowing that particular Lancaster would definitely drop its bombs. The Merlin engines enabled one final advantage that German intelligence consistently undervalued, until too late. Lancasters could cruise at 200 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, but they could also throttle back and loiter at 180 miles per hour, or surge to 240 when pursued. This speed flexibility disrupted night fighter tactics built around predictable bomber velocities. Luftwaffe pilots would set up stern approaches based on calculated closure rates, only to find their targets suddenly accelerating or decelerating, throwing off deflection angles and forcing dangerous adjustments in the dark. The night of 16th May 1943 changed everything. Operation Chastise wasn't the largest raid Bomber Command had mounted, nor the most destructive by conventional measures, but it accomplished something far more valuable than levelling another industrial district. It shattered German confidence in their defences, whilst simultaneously transforming how the Luftwaffe perceived the Lancaster. 19 specially modified Lancasters from 617 Squadron lifted off from RAF Scampton carrying Barnes-Wallace's cylindrical bouncing bombs, each weighing 9,250 pounds. The target selection itself announced audacity bordering on madness. The Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams, structures the Germans considered virtually indestructible. The modification work on these Lancasters revealed the aircraft's astonishing adaptability. Engineers had removed the bomb bay doors entirely, fitting caliper arms to hold the spinning cylindrical mine. The bomb had to be spun backwards at 500 revolutions per minute before release, achieved through a hydraulic motor and belt drive system jury-rigged into the fuselage. Weight calculations were so critical that the bomb sight had been replaced with a crude but effective arrangement using two spotlights angled to converge at exactly 60 feet above water. When the light pools merged, the Lancaster was at the precise height needed for weapon release. German intelligence had never conceived that heavy bombers could be modified so radically for such specific missions. Wing Commander Guy Gibson led the formation across occupied Europe at treetop height, below radar coverage, navigating by moonlight and landmarks. The Germans had concentrated their defensive efforts on high-altitude approaches. Nobody had seriously considered that four-engine bombers weighing over 30 tons could safely operate at 100 feet in darkness. This wasn't just tactical surprise. It represented a fundamental reassessment of what heavy bombers could do. The Luftwaffe had built their defensive doctrine around altitudes where flak and fighters operated most effectively. The dams raid proved that Lancasters could simply fly underneath that entire defensive architecture. At 12:28 on 17th of May, Gibson's Lancaster released its weapon against the Möhne Dam. The mine skipped across the reservoir surface exactly as Wallace had calculated, struck the dam wall, sank whilst still rotating, and detonated at the optimal depth of 30 feet. The first weapon cracked, but didn't breach the dam. The second and third attempts similarly failed to break through. But when Flight Lieutenant Maltby's Lancaster dropped the fifth weapon at 12:49, the Möhne Dam collapsed. 330 million tons of water exploded through the breach, creating a tidal wave that reached 25 feet high and travelled at nearly 15 miles per hour down the Ruhr Valley. Power stations drowned, factories flooded, rail lines washed away, and over 1,600 people died in the deluge. The Eder Dam fell 90 minutes later after 3 weapons breached its wall, releasing another 200 million tons of water. German officials woke Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, at his hotel with the news. His immediate reaction, documented in interrogation transcripts, was disbelief, followed by a chilling realization. If they can do this to dams, what else have we assumed was safe? That question haunted German strategic planning for the remainder of the war. The dams raid proved that British ingenuity combined with Lancaster capability could strike targets previously considered invulnerable. 8 Lancasters didn't return from Operation Chastise, a 42% loss rate that would be unsustainable in regular operations. But the propaganda value vastly exceeded the tactical gains. Within days, reconnaissance photographs of the breached dams circulated through Allied intelligence, whilst German newspapers struggled to explain the disaster. The Luftwaffe faced uncomfortable questions from Göring's staff. How had 19 bombers penetrated to the industrial heartland, attacked at leisure for nearly 2 hours, and escaped with only moderate losses? The barn metaphor began curdling into something darker. These weren't clumsy targets. These were precision weapons, platforms capable of achieving what seemed impossible. German defensive adjustments came swiftly, but revealed the depth of their concern. Low-level flak emplacements quadrupled around critical infrastructure within weeks. Searchlight batteries received orders to cover low-altitude approaches they'd previously ignored. Naval-style anti-torpedo nets appeared in reservoirs and canals, despite the logistical absurdity of protecting inland waters from aerial torpedoes. The Kriegsmarine diverted resources to protect dams as though they were capital ships. Every countermeasure acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. The Lancaster had capabilities that existing defensive doctrine hadn't anticipated. More significantly, the psychological impact rippled through Luftwaffe night fighter squadrons. If Lancasters could attack at 100 feet with precision, what prevented them from doing so routinely? Night fighter tactics depended on altitude advantage and radar-guided intercepts between 15,000 and 22,000 feet. The dams raid demonstrated that Lancaster crews possessed the skill and nerve to operate in an entirely different engagement envelope where German advantages evaporated. Suddenly, the flying barn looked less like a liability and more like a threat that could manifest at any altitude, any time, carrying weapons specifically engineered to destroy whatever the British deemed worthy of destruction. The night sky over Germany between 1943 and 1944 hosted a lethal ballet that most people never witnessed, but thousands never survived. While the rest of Europe slept, Lancaster bombers and German night fighters fought in darkness so complete that combatants often never saw each other until tracers lit the void. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkers, Ju-88 night fighters represented Germany's primary counter to RAF night bombing, and their crews developed techniques specifically tailored to exploit Lancaster vulnerabilities. Yet these same crews increasingly filed reports describing near misses, unexpected resistance, and a creeping recognition that hunting the flying barn carried costs other bombers didn't impose. The Germans had transformed night fighting into a science by 1943. Their Himmelbett system divided airspace over occupied Europe into boxes, each monitored by ground-based Würzburg radar stations that vectored assigned night fighters onto bomber streams. Once within range, the fighter's own Liechtenstein airborne radar took over, guiding the pilot to within visual distance, usually about 200 yards, where skilled crews could identify bomber types by silhouette. Feldwebel Wilhelm Süss, a radar operator with NJG-3, described the Lancasters' radar signature as unmistakable, wider and stronger than Halifax's, with a distinctive double return from the wings. Finding Lancasters was never the problem. Killing them efficiently was where things became complicated. The classic night fighter attack profile approached from below and behind, exploiting the Lancaster's blind spot beneath the tail. British designers had recognized this vulnerability, and some Lancasters carried ventral turrets, but these were often removed to save weight and reduce drag, particularly as bomb loads increased. The Bf-110 crew would ease into position roughly 100 feet below and 150 feet behind, then pull up slightly to bring their nose-mounted armament to bear. Two 20mm cannons and four 7.92mm machine guns would unleash a 2-second burst into the bomber's belly, aiming for the wing roots where fuel tanks clustered. In theory, this attack achieved kills in a single pass. Theory and practice diverged considerably when the target was a Lancaster. Hauptmann Martin Drews, who claimed 52 night victories, noted a peculiar phenomenon in his combat diary from August 1943. Lancasters absorb punishment differently than other types. You see strikes, you see pieces flying off, you're certain you've achieved fatal damage. Then the aircraft continues flying, sometimes for minutes, sometimes all the way to target and back. The fuel tanks have some sort of self-sealing that works better than intelligence suggested. The airframe is stronger. It's like shooting an ox instead of a horse. You need more bullets in more critical places. The summer of 1943 saw this dynamic play out with brutal clarity during the Battle of Hamburg. Between 24th of July and 3rd August, Bomber Command launched 4 major raids involving over 700 Lancasters among the total force. The RAF had just introduced window, bundles of aluminium strips dropped to confuse German radar. Suddenly, the technological advantage shifted dramatically. Night fighters could no longer rely on radar guidance, forcing them back to visual hunting techniques. In the chaos, with radar screens white with false returns, Lancaster formations pressed through with losses lower than expected. On the night of 27 to 28 July alone, 787 bombers attacked Hamburg and only 17 were lost, a 2.2% loss rate that German defences were supposed to make impossible. Oberleutnant Paul Zorner, eventually credited with 59 night victories, described the window raids as a turning point in how he approached Lancasters. Before window, we had certainty. Radar told us where they were. We closed, we fired, we killed. After window, we hunted by moonlight, by exhaust flames, by luck. The Lancasters seemed to know this made them less vulnerable. Their formations tightened. Their gunners became more aggressive. I had 3 encounters in August where Lancaster rear gunners hit my aircraft before I could position for a shot. These weren't defensive reactions, these were counter-attacks. The Ju-88 offered different capabilities, particularly the later models, equipped with Schräge Musik, upward-firing cannons mounted behind the cockpit at a 70-degree angle. This installation allowed the fighter to position directly beneath a bomber, match its speed, and fire upward into the fuselage without exposing itself to return fire. The system should have been devastatingly effective against Lancasters. In practice, experienced Lancaster pilots developed an evasive maneuver called the corkscrew, a violent, spiraling dive combining rolls and direction changes that could throw off even perfectly positioned attackers. Flight engineer accounts describe pilots initiating corkscrews so aggressive that loose equipment floated momentarily in zero gravity before crashing into crew members as the Lancaster pulled through the bottom of the maneuver. By early 1944, German night fighter tactics had evolved specifically around Lancaster characteristics. Training emphasized multi-pass attacks rather than single devastating strikes. Crews learned to target specific systems, shoot out two engines on the same wing to create uncontrollable asymmetric thrust, aim for the tailplane to compromise elevator control, if possible kill the pilot with a head-on pass, though this required suicidal closure rates. Each technique acknowledged that Lancasters wouldn't simply fold up and die like Wellingtons or Stirlings often did. They required dedicated effort to destroy, and that effort consumed time and fuel whilst exposing the night fighter to other hazards, wandering friendly flak, other bombers' defensive fire, or RAF mosquito intruders hunting the hunters. The predator-prey relationship had achieved an uncomfortable equilibrium. German night fighters could find and engage Lancasters with reasonable reliability, but actual kill rates remained frustratingly low relative to contact rates. Lancaster crews, meanwhile, knew that every mission might end in a 3-second burst of cannon fire from darkness, yet they climbed into those perspex greenhouses night after night. The mutual fear was perhaps the most honest emotion in the night sky. The hunters feared the barn as much as the barn feared the hunters. The Lancaster's bomb bay measured 33 feet long and remained completely unobstructed by structural members, a design feature that seemed unremarkable until Barnes-Wallis started calculating what could fit inside that cavernous space. By 1944, those calculations had produced weapons so large that only the Lancaster could carry them, transforming the aircraft from general-purpose heavy bomber into a specialized instrument for destroying targets that conventional ordnance couldn't scratch. The Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs didn't just expand the Lancaster's capabilities, they created entirely new categories of vulnerability for German strategic assets. The Tallboy entered service in June 1944, weighing 12,000 pounds and measuring 21 feet in length. Wallis had designed it not to explode on impact, but to penetrate deep into earth or concrete before detonation, creating seismic shockwaves that would shatter structures from within. The weapon required release from at least 18,000 feet to achieve the terminal velocity needed for penetration, roughly 750 miles per hour at impact. No other Allied bomber possessed both the payload capacity and the altitude performance to deliver Tallboy effectively. The Lancaster carried it externally, suspended beneath the fuselage, transforming the aircraft's silhouette into something even more ungainly than usual. German spotters learned to identify Tallboy-equipped Lancasters by the bulge beneath the belly, and those identifications triggered immediate alerts because Tallboy meant critical targets were about to receive special attention. The Saumur Tunnel carried the main rail line between occupied France and Germany through a hillside in the Loire Valley. On 8th and 9th June 1944, 19 Lancasters from 617 Squadron attacked with Tallboy bombs. One weapon penetrated 60 feet of earth before detonating directly beneath the tunnel, collapsing it so completely that German engineers never fully reopened the line. Rail traffic rerouted through longer, less efficient paths, delaying Wehrmacht reinforcements desperately needed in Normandy. This single raid demonstrated how Tallboy transformed target selection. Structures that required hundreds of conventional bombs and repeated raids could now be destroyed with fewer than 20 precision strikes. The U-boat pens presented an even more compelling demonstration. At Brest, La Pallice, and other French Atlantic ports, the Kriegsmarine had constructed submarine shelters with reinforced concrete roofs measuring up to 20 feet thick. These fortifications had withstood thousands of tons of conventional bombs throughout 1941-1943 with minimal damage. American daylight raids in 1943 achieved nothing beyond cratering the surrounding areas whilst losing dozens of B-17s to flak. On 6th August 1944, Lancasters attacked the pens at Brest with Tallboy. 5 direct hits punched through the concrete roofs, something intelligence analysts had calculated as impossible, and collapsed internal structures, rendering the facility unusable. Albert Speer later told interrogators that the U-boat pen attacks proved we had no sanctuary from British bombs, regardless of how much concrete we poured. Then came Grand Slam, a weapon so absurd in conception that German intelligence initially dismissed reports as disinformation. This monster weighed 22,000 pounds, more than 10 tons, and measured over 25 feet in length. A standard Lancaster couldn't carry Grand Slam. Specially modified aircraft with strengthened undercarriages, uprated engines, and all armour plating removed were required. These modified Lancasters sacrificed defensive armament and crew comfort entirely, becoming dedicated delivery vehicles for a single bomb. The first operational use occurred on 14th of March 1945 against the Bielefeld Viaduct, a vital rail bridge that had survived multiple previous attacks. One Grand Slam struck near the viaduct's base, and the resulting earthquake effect collapsed 100 yards of the structure into rubble. Repair proved impossible. The Germans simply abandoned the route. What terrified German defenders wasn't merely the size of these weapons, but their precision. Tallboy and Grand Slam required accurate release from high altitude, typically 18,000 to 20,000 feet, to achieve the velocity and trajectory needed for penetration. This demanded sophisticated bomb sights, skilled bombardiers, and stable bombing platforms. The Lancaster's automatic bomb sight, coupled with the aircraft's stable high-altitude handling, made this possible. Crews would fly straight and level for 30 to 45 seconds during the bombing run, making micro-adjustments based on the bomb site's calculations. German flak crews learned to dread these runs because the Lancasters wouldn't deviate despite intensive anti-aircraft fire. The commitment to accuracy meant accepting hits rather than taking evasive action. The psychological warfare element amplified the physical destruction. When a Tallboy or Grand Slam hit near a target, even if it missed, the resulting crater measured 80 feet deep and 100 feet across. Workers at nearby facilities could hear the detonation from miles away, feel the ground shake, and understand that any structure within a quarter-mile radius could be utterly destroyed by a single weapon. Morale reports from German industrial sites in 1945 documented widespread absenteeism following Grand Slam attacks, with workers refusing to return even to undamaged facilities because the British can collapse the entire factory with one bomb if they choose. The logistics behind deploying these weapons revealed the Lancasters' unique position in bomber command. By early 1945, 617 Squadron and 9 Squadron operated as specialist units exclusively tasked with Tallboy and Grand Slam missions. These squadrons attacked bridges, viaducts, U-boat pens, and V-weapon sites that conventional bombers couldn't meaningfully damage. Intelligence would identify a hardened target, planners would assign the specialist Lancaster squadrons, and within days the target would cease to exist. This capability, Precision destruction of fortified structures had never existed before in military aviation. The Germans could disperse factories, move headquarters, and hide supply dumps, but they couldn't hide bridges or move submarine pens. The Lancaster with earthquake bombs could reach anything fixed and destroy it. The final irony emerged in the arithmetic of destruction. A typical Lancaster raid might involve 200 aircraft dropping 600 tons of conventional bombs to achieve moderate damage against an industrial area. A single Grand Slam strike delivered the equivalent destructive effect against a point target whilst exposing only one crew to danger. From the German perspective, this made the Lancaster even more terrifying. You couldn't predict where these specialist attacks would occur, couldn't defend against the penetrating weapons effectively, and couldn't repair the damage once it happened. The flying barn had become something far worse, a strategic weapon capable of selective annihilation. The Lancaster's operational statistics present a paradox that confounded both Allied planners and German defenders throughout the war. Between 1942 and 1945, Bomber Command lost 3,249 Lancasters to enemy action, a staggering number representing roughly 43% of all Lancasters built. For comparison, the Halifax heavy bomber suffered a 34% loss rate, whilst the older Sterling endured nearly 50% losses before being withdrawn from frontline service. By these figures, the Lancaster appeared to be a moderately dangerous aircraft to crew, neither the safest nor the most lethal option available. Yet this same aircraft completed 156,000 operational sorties and dropped 608,612 tons of bombs, more than any other British bomber type by enormous margins. The mathematics created a strange psychological effect. German defenders killed Lancasters in large numbers, but could never kill enough to matter. The loss rate fluctuated dramatically, depending on target and defensive conditions. During the disastrous Nuremberg raid on 30-31 March 1944, Bomber Command dispatched 795 aircraft, including 572 Lancasters. German night fighters exploited unusually clear weather and good moonlight to achieve catastrophic results. 95 bombers failed to return, and 71 of those were Lancasters. This represented a 12.4% loss rate for Lancasters specifically, well above the 5% threshold Bomber Command considered sustainable. Yet within weeks, Lancaster squadrons were mounting raids with loss rates below 2%. The aircraft's survivability depended enormously on tactics, weather, routing, and defensive saturation, rather than inherent vulnerability. What separated the Lancaster from other heavy bombers wasn't invulnerability, it was capacity for sustained operations despite losses. The production line at Avro's Chadderton factory and shadow factories across Britain delivered Lancasters at a rate that consistently exceeded losses. In 1943 alone, British factories produced 2,126 Lancasters, whilst losses totalled 146. This meant that even during the most intensive period of the bombing campaign, Lancaster strength increased month over month. German intelligence officers tracking Bomber Command order of battle watched Lancaster squadron numbers grow from 44 operational aircraft in January 1942 to over 700 by January 1944. No matter how many they shot down, more appeared. The crew experience added another layer to the paradox. A Lancaster crew faced a 44% chance of death and a 12% chance of becoming prisoners of war over a standard 30-operation tour. These odds meant that statistically, fewer than half of crews would complete their tours unscathed. Flight engineer Norman Ashton from 467 Squadron RAAF later described the mental calculation every crew made. You knew the numbers, you'd watched aircraft fail to return, you'd seen new crews arrive and disappear within weeks. But you also knew that some crews did survive, and you convinced yourself yours would be among them. What else could you do? This grim arithmetic became common knowledge throughout Bomber Command by mid-1943, yet volunteers continued filling crew positions faster than losses could deplete them. The Lancasters' ability to return home despite horrific damage contributed significantly to crew confidence, even whilst overall loss statistics remained sobering. Photographs from debriefing sessions show Lancasters with entire sections of fuselage blown away, tailplanes shredded by flak, engines completely destroyed, yet still flying. Lancaster ED-88. Admiral Prune completed 140 operations between 1942 and 1945, a record that defied all statistical probability. Each time crews heard stories about Lancasters surviving impossible damage, it reinforced a belief that skill and luck might overcome the odds. The aircraft had earned a reputation as tough rather than fragile, and that reputation mattered psychologically, even if the loss statistics suggested otherwise. From the German perspective, the paradox manifested as a crisis of resource allocation. Night fighter units and flak batteries were destroying 40 to 50 Lancasters per month throughout 1943 and 1944, impressive numbers that should have degraded British capabilities. Instead, Lancaster raids intensified, the tonnage dropped increased. The accuracy improved as crews gained experience and new targeting technologies deployed. Luftwaffe commanders found themselves trapped in an unsustainable equation. They were winning tactical battles by shooting down substantial numbers of bombers, but losing the strategic campaign because British industrial capacity and crew training pipelines outpaced German attrition efforts. Every Lancaster destroyed represented a victory, yet those victories accumulated into strategic defeat. The sustainability question extended beyond mere production numbers into training capacity and operational doctrine. Bomber Command had developed a system capable of absorbing 44% losses whilst maintaining operational tempo. Heavy conversion units across Britain trained replacement crews continuously, with experienced instructors passing on lessons learned from combat operations. New crews arrived at operational squadrons already familiar with Lancaster systems, tactics and procedures. The learning curve was steep but manageable, unlike earlier in the war when inadequate training sent unprepared crews to their deaths. By 1944, a replacement crew could be operational within weeks of arriving at squadron, maintaining force strength despite ongoing losses. The psychological warfare implications of this paradox weren't lost on German defenders. Flak crews might down a Lancaster in flames one night, then face another 50 the following week. The individual victory provided no strategic reassurance because the bomber stream kept coming regardless. German home front propaganda increasingly struggled to frame defensive victories in meaningful terms. Announcing that night fighters had destroyed 20 British bombers sounded impressive until citizens asked why their city had still been bombed. The Lancasters' combination of high losses and high operational tempo created a perception of unstoppable momentum that numbers alone didn't convey. The final element of the paradox emerged in the post-war accounting. Despite losing nearly half of all Lancasters built, the type had delivered 2/3 of Bomber Command's total bomb tonnage. The ratio of destruction delivered to aircraft loss favoured the Lancaster over all other British heavy bomber types. Each Lancaster lost had, on average, completed more sorties and dropped more bombs than Halifaxes, Stirlings, or any other competitor. The aircraft was simultaneously vulnerable and effective, mortal and mission capable, feared by its crews and relied upon by commanders who had no better alternative. The most compelling evidence of German fear towards the Lancaster comes not from propaganda or strategic assessments, but from the unguarded words of Luftwaffe personnel captured and interrogated by Allied intelligence. These interrogation transcripts, declassified decades after the war, reveal a consistent pattern. German air crews respected American daylight raids for their precision and fighter escorts, but they dreaded Lancaster night attacks for reasons that had little to do with military logic and everything to do with psychological exhaustion. Oberst Werner Strebes, a night fighter ace with 65 confirmed kills, told his interrogators in May 1945 that fighting the Americans was combat, dangerous but comprehensible. Fighting the Lancasters at night was hunting ghosts that burned your cities whilst you hunted them. The interrogation reports from Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe interrogation centre for captured Allied airmen, contain dozens of references to Lancaster capabilities from the German perspective. One particularly revealing document from November 1943 records a conversation between Hauptmann Josef Kamhuber and several night fighter pilots. Kamhuber asked which bomber type they preferred to avoid if given the choice. The unanimous response was Lancaster formations, specifically large-scale Lancaster streams. The pilots explained that Halifax formations tended to be smaller and less concentrated, making them easier to exploit. Stirlings flew lower and slower, presenting more favourable engagement geometry. American B-17s operated in daylight with known approach routes. Lancasters came at night in hundreds, scattered across wide areas with unpredictable routings, and maintained momentum regardless of losses. The flak crew's perspective appears in Home Defence Unit reports collected by British intelligence from captured documents. A report from Flakgruppe Frankfurt, dated February 1944, describes engagement frustrations in blunt terms. Lancaster formations maintain altitude and speed through barrage concentrations that disperse other bomber types. Our predictive fire solutions assume normal, evasive reactions. Lancaster pilots frequently maintain course despite being bracketed by bursts, presumably prioritizing bomb run accuracy over survival. This behavior results in lower hit probabilities than calculation suggests. The report continues with a request for increased ammunition allocation specifically for Lancaster raids, noting that standard defensive fire proving insufficient against these formations. Perhaps most revealing are the accounts from German civilians working in the defense industry who witnessed Lancaster attacks firsthand. A collection of interviews conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey in 1945 includes testimony from August Schmidt, a shift supervisor at the Krupp Works in Essen. Schmidt described the evolution of his reactions to air raids between 1942 and 1945. Early in the war, you heard the sirens and felt concern, but not terror. The bombs fell randomly. Damage was limited. By 1943, when the Lancasters came in strength, everything changed. You knew they would find the factory. You knew the bombs would hit. The sound of their engines, that deep rumble of hundreds approaching, became worse than the explosions themselves because it meant hours of sustained attack were coming. The acoustic signature of Lancaster formations features repeatedly in German accounts. Unlike American formations, which announced their presence with the high-pitched buzz of thousands of radial engines in daylight, Lancaster streams produced a low-frequency throb that penetrated buildings and shelters. Civilians in Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne reported hearing the approaching formations for 10 to 15 minutes before bombs fell, creating prolonged anticipation that amplified fear. Luftwaffe sound-ranging operators noted that Lancaster engine noise carried further than expected, possibly due to the specific resonance of 4 synchronized Merlins. This acoustic warning paradoxically made raids more terrifying. Knowing they were coming, but not knowing exactly when or where bombs would land, stretched nerves to breaking. The German Defensive Command Structure's internal communications reveal strategic-level anxiety about Lancaster capabilities. A memo from Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, commanding Luftwaffe Reich in late 1944, addressed force allocation priorities. Stumpf noted that whilst American daylight raids received more attention from high command due to their visibility and political significance, the sustained night offensive by Lancaster forces represents the greater threat to war production and civilian morale. American raids are surgical strikes that can be defended through concentration. Lancaster attacks are sledgehammer blows distributed across time and geography in patterns that defeat defensive concentration. The memo recommended shifting night fighter resources away from coastal intercept zones toward target area defense, acknowledging that stopping Lancaster formations before they reached targets had proven largely impossible. The testimony of German night fighter crews who survived the war adds texture to the statistical record. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the highest scoring night fighter ace with 121 confirmed victories, gave extensive interviews in the 1950s before his death. He described Lancaster formations as professionally flown by crews who understood their survival depended on mutual support and disciplined flying. You couldn't pick off stragglers easily because they maintained formation better than other types. The rear gunners were alert and aggressive. Most significantly, the Lancasters kept coming regardless of losses. We might shoot down 20 in a night, and 2 nights later there would be just as many attacking again. Schnaufer's respect for Lancaster crews was notable precisely because it came from a man who had killed so many of them. The psychological element of sustained operations emerges clearly in interrogation reports from late war captures. Younger Luftwaffe personnel who joined defensive units in 1944 described Lancaster raids as a fact of existence rather than discrete events. They came every week, sometimes several times per week, explained Lieutenant Franz Stigler, captured after bailing out over Holland in March 1945. You stopped thinking about individual raids and started thinking about the cumulative effect. Your city under constant siege, your sleep constantly interrupted, your family in perpetual danger. The Lancaster wasn't just an aircraft, it was a symbol of your inability to protect your homeland despite everything you'd been told about German superiority. This admission that the Lancaster represented German defensive failure cuts deeper than tactical assessments. The final category of evidence comes from post-war debriefings of German commanders conducted during the Strategic Bombing Survey. When asked which aspects of the Allied bombing campaign had been most effective, multiple commanders mentioned the psychological weight of sustained Lancaster night attacks. General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, who oversaw German aircraft production, stated bluntly, "The Americans hurt our production capacity with precision attacks on specific industries. The British with their Lancasters broke the will of workers who couldn't sleep, couldn't feel safe, and couldn't maintain productivity under constant night bombardment. Both were effective. The Lancaster campaign was more corrosive to morale. The distinction mattered. The Germans could rebuild factories and reroute production, but they couldn't restore psychological resilience once it had been ground away by months of night attacks. The Lancasters' combat career ended in May 1945, but its transformation from derided target to legendary weapon had already reshaped how nations thought about strategic bombing. When the first Lancasters entered service in early 1942, conventional wisdom held that heavy bombers needed heavy defensive armament, high-altitude performance, and precision bomb sights to survive and deliver ordnance effectively. The Americans built the B-17 and B-24 around these principles, bristling with gun turrets and designed for daylight formation flying. The Lancaster followed a different philosophy entirely: maximize payload capacity, accept moderate defensive armament, operate at night in concentrated streams, and overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers and persistence. By war's end, this approach had proven devastatingly effective despite violating established doctrine. The numbers tell the strategic story with brutal clarity. Lancaster squadrons flew 156,000 sorties and dropped 608,612 tons of bombs, whilst losing 3,249 aircraft. Compare this to the Halifax, which flew 75,532 sorties and dropped 227,610 tons, whilst losing 1,833 aircraft. The Lancaster achieved more than double the sorties and nearly triple the tonnage, with roughly 80% higher losses. The efficiency ratio, tons dropped per aircraft lost, favoured the Lancaster significantly. Each Lancaster lost had delivered an average of 187 tons before being destroyed. Each Halifax managed 124 tons. The Sterling, withdrawn from main force operations by 1944 due to unsustainable losses, achieved only 89 tons per aircraft lost. The barn had proven to be a workhorse that justified its casualties through sheer productive output. The doctrinal shift the Lancaster catalyzed became apparent in post-war strategic planning. The United States Air Force, despite its commitment to daylight precision bombing during the war, began developing heavy bombers that borrowed heavily from Lancaster principles. The B-36 Peacemaker, designed in the late 1940s, featured an enormous bomb bay optimized for carrying single massive weapons, including nuclear bombs, rather than maximum defensive armament. The later B-52 Stratofortress continued this evolution, prioritizing payload and range over defensive guns. By the 1960s, heavy bombers had largely abandoned the B-17's Fortress concept in favor of the Lancaster's payload-focused philosophy. The barn had won the architectural argument. The Lancaster's adaptability proved as influential as its raw capability. Beyond standard bombing operations, Lancasters performed maritime patrol, electronic warfare, photographic reconnaissance, and eventually nuclear test monitoring. Modified Lancasters dropped the first 12,000-pound bombs, the first 22,000-pound bombs, and pioneered low-level marking techniques that revolutionized target identification. The aircraft served with RAF Coastal Command hunting U-boats, operated in the Middle East and Far East theatres, and continued in various roles until final retirement in 1963, 18 years after the war ended. Few military aircraft ever achieved such operational longevity or versatility. The human cost embedded in the Lancaster's legacy deserves acknowledgement without sentimentality. Of the roughly 125,000 aircrews who served in Bomber Command during the war, 55,573 were killed in action, a 44% fatality rate that exceeded British infantry losses in percentage terms. Lancaster crews comprised the majority of those losses from 1942 onwards. These men volunteered for service knowing the odds, climbed into unheated aircraft at -40 degrees Celsius, and flew through flak concentrations and night fighter attacks that killed randomly and without warning. Their casualty rate approached that of U-boat crews, another service where mathematical probability favoured death over survival. The Lancasters' effectiveness was built upon their willingness to accept those odds repeatedly. German cities bore the physical evidence of Lancaster capability for decades after the war. Hamburg, where firestorm attacks in July 1943 killed over 40,000 people, retained bombed-out shells of buildings into the 1960s. Dresden's reconstruction took until the 1990s to restore some of what was destroyed in February 1945. Cologne's cathedral stood surrounded by rubble for years, testament to both the selective nature of some bombing and the comprehensive destruction of most urban fabric. Whether these attacks constituted military necessity, war crimes, or something between remains debated. What isn't debatable is that the Lancaster made them possible on a scale previously unachievable. The nickname that began as mockery ended as acknowledgement. Post-war Luftwaffe veterans writing memoirs routinely referred to Lancasters with a respect bordering on reverence. the same way fighter pilots speak of worthy adversaries. The barn metaphor disappeared from German accounts by 1944, replaced with clinical descriptions of viermotorige Britische Bomber, four-engine British bombers that carried none of the earlier dismissiveness. This linguistic shift reflected an operational reality. By late war, German defences had adapted specifically to counter Lancaster tactics, developing techniques and technologies aimed at the aircraft that dominated RAF bomber streams. The barn had become the primary threat rather than an amusing sideshow. The final Lancaster sorties flew on 25th of April 1945, dropping food supplies to starving Dutch civilians in Operation Manna. Thousands of Lancasters made low-level passes over Holland, their bomb bays filled with flour, chocolate and tinned meat instead of explosives. Dutch civilians who had spent years sheltering from these same aircraft now watched them pass overhead, delivering salvation rather than destruction. The operational flexibility that allowed this transformation from strategic bomber to humanitarian relief aircraft within days exemplified the Lancaster's fundamental adaptability. The aircraft could be whatever the mission required, whether that was destroying cities or feeding refugees. The preservation of surviving Lancasters speaks to their lasting cultural impact. Only two remain airworthy worldwide, one in Britain, one in Canada, and both fly regularly at air shows where they draw enormous crowds. The sound of four Merlins at full power evokes immediate recognition from anyone familiar with aviation history. Museums across the Commonwealth display static Lancasters, and veterans organisations maintain memorial funds specifically for Lancaster restoration. This sustained public interest, 8 decades after the aircraft's introduction, suggests the Lancaster transcended mere military hardware to become a symbol of something larger. British persistence, Allied determination, or perhaps the industrial capacity to wage total war regardless of cost. The strategic bombing campaign the Lancaster enabled remains controversial precisely because it succeeded so completely. Had Bomber Command failed to meaningfully damage German war production or civilian morale, historians would dismiss it as a costly diversion of resources. Instead, the campaign demonstrably degraded German industrial output, tied down hundreds of thousands of personnel in defensive roles, and forced resource allocation toward defending the homeland rather than supporting frontline operations. These effects came at the cost of 55,573 Allied aircrew dead and hundreds of thousands of German civilians killed. The Lancaster made this exchange possible. Whether it made it justifiable remains an open question that each generation answers differently. What isn't questionable is that the flying barn earned its fearsome reputation through operational results rather than propaganda. German crews called it a barn because it looked vulnerable, then learned it was lethal. They shot down thousands, whilst thousands more kept coming. They developed countermeasures that reduced effectiveness, but never stopped the attacks. They respected it, feared it, and ultimately couldn't defeat it. The nickname stuck, but the meaning transformed. From insult to inadvertent tribute to an aircraft that refused to be anything other than exactly what it was designed to be. A weapon delivery platform that prioritized its mission over everything else, including the survival of those who flew it. In the calculus of total war, that single-minded purpose proved devastatingly effective.